Sorry, it's recording. All right, before I let you guys do your study guides and stuff, we're just going to finish up with the last part of the progressive era and talking about the parts that, like things that didn't happen. Okay, who was excluded from the reforms that were taking place? Because remember, progressives were changing the bad stuff, or we're trying, but there's always groups that are going to be left out. All right, so let's look maybe at that. All right, so we know that African Americans were largely excluded from the reforms that took place during this movement. But look at some of these other groups that maybe you did know. The blacks or African Americans were they were living in the Jim Crow South. That's about 44 out of 5 or something like that of the African Americans. It says 4/5 of African Americans lived in the South, but yet they couldn't move because they were always repressed in some way. So they were living. What is the Jim Crow South? What am I even talking about?
It's the law that said that segregation was allowed.
Okay, we talked a little bit about that yesterday, didn't we, in here?
Yeah.
Okay. I couldn't remember which groups I did and which ones I didn't.
It was like basically we're equal. I don't know.
Do what? Say that again?
Like we're equal, but we're not.
Okay. So Plessy versus Ferguson. So make sure you remember that. Again, why were the Catholics discriminated against?
Because they were Europeans, they were immigrants, they were Christians.
Okay. And so mostly coming from Ireland and Italian and Spanish. Okay. Anti-Jewish. I still have not found a lot on the anti-Semitism aspect, other than that some of them came from some of these southern parts of Europe, like southeastern parts, and then over into some of the Asian countries, or Middle Eastern countries, I'm sorry. And you've got anti-Asian, and we knew this because we saw some of the laws that were being passed, like the Chinese Exclusion Act and those kinds of things. All right. Plessy versus Ferguson. This is making segregation legal. And again, what court case overturns this? Do you remember what we were talking about yesterday?
Something. It started to.
Yeah. Brown versus Board of Education. That's going to be the one that, but it doesn't overturn it until 1954. All right. But even if when it gets overturned, they still don't abide by the rules. And we'll talk some more about that when we get to the Civil Rights Movement. But yeah, the Jim Crow South, again, too, those were discriminated. Some of those were laws that were written down. Some of them were just practices. Just remember that as well. KKK was around. Reborn again in 1915 in Georgia, and then it spreads across the South. It even goes into the North. They not only discriminated against African Americans, but they discriminated against all of these groups. They were 100% nativists. What were nativists again? Nativism, remember that movement? All right, it's meaning that they want to get rid of all of the immigrants and anybody that they thought were impure. Okay, they wanted to be 100% American. All right, it was also big in the North. The Klan was. Upstate New York was a big place. This says in New York had over 2 million members, but in its heyday in the 1920s, there were for some reason 10 million is sticking out. After that, it starts to diminish, but you'll see them rear their head every once in a while. They and during the Civil Rights Movement, they come back around a little bit too. All right. All right, lynchings. So this is why they had the anti-lynching law. A lot of people blame the minority groups for them losing their jobs. There was some downplay in the economy. There was a couple of recessions. Nobody thought to think that it was because of the fact that we were linked to the gold standard, or there wasn't enough money in circulation, or inflation, or that the companies just wanted to keep their bottom line a certain way. But they blamed the minorities, so they started to pick on these groups a lot. So we only hear about like the African Americans being lynched, meaning hanged, but lynching was also used against the Chinese as well. So you don't hear much about that. All right, and this shows you kind of where these were taking place. So the top 10 states in the number of lynchings. Kentucky's number 9. So during this time period, the 20s, the 30s too, Kentucky was in the top 10 for lynchings. Number 1, Mississippi. And they're going to stay there for a while because they're some of the problems that happened during the Civil Rights Movement, as well as Alabama and Georgia. Number 2 is Georgia. 3 is Texas. And so on. 4 is Louisiana. So Florida. So it's in the South. And you've got Massachusetts and Connecticut too. Oh, it's states with no lynchings: Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Alaska.
And Hawaii.
And Hawaii. See, I want to go to Hawaii. They're just chill.
I know. I love Hawaii. My mom's been like 5 times, and none of them have been with me. I'm very happy.
Claire says she's going to school in Hawaii because she wants to be a marine biologist.
Mm-hmm.
And she goes, "You can go with me if you want to go." Like, I'll be retiring about that time. Peace out. I'm gone.
It's super cool.
All right, so the failures are the things they did not achieve. They were upper and middle class leaders. There really wasn't a leadership on the lower levels. So that was a problem. They really weren't representative of the people that they were trying to fight for. So some people lost faith in that. All right, it says unions often would not allow women, African Americans, or immigrants to join. So they were still discriminated against in their workplace. They still had to face the unsafe and hostile work environments that their white counterparts could enjoy. Again, like I told you before, the temperance movement was designed to stop the drinking of Irish Catholics. Instead of embracing, they tried to do something about it. They blamed them for society's problems when they were there before they got here. Who had Booker T. Washington in here? Anybody? All right, he was one. I don't know what you would call him. He struggled to get African Americans a place, kind of making sure that they could compete with their white counterparts. Have you ever heard of Tuskegee Airmen? Tuskegee, the movie? Okay, well, it comes from his institute. He sets up a college. He believed in that education was power. He also believed that if they could become educated and they could use their economic power, or they would get more economic power. And then they could demand that equality. People would see them as equals rather than the low man on the totem pole. If they could get educated, they could get a good paying job, they could be equal as whites. All right. All right. That was his philosophy. He also founded the National Negro Business League. So he was also promoting businesses for African Americans. I think this was on the next slide. All right, he was kind of the first one that championed the nonviolent programs. Like, we always associate it with Martin Luther King, Dr. King, but Booker T was actually one of the first ones to champion that nonviolence, better yourself, and then they'll see us as equals type of attitude. So he says to work patiently, but again, the ones that were being discriminated against, the ones that were being targeted by the KKK and other people, they didn't like that too much. So his movements really didn't take off. So what did they do? They tried some back to Africa programs. Let's go, if they think we're African Americans, okay, let's leave and go back to Africa. That didn't really work. But, you know, when you get frustrated, you're going to try something that drastic. All right. So, who had Ida Wells? Somebody did. I think she was a cool and interesting person. And she exposes the names in Tennessee of the people that lynched African Americans. So she worked to figure out who these people were, and then she released their names. Well, yeah, she's going to become a target. So she's forced to leave her hometown, leave her family. So she revealed in her book that the ones that were lynched were the ones who were successful. So these were African Americans who were becoming successful in whatever business or whatever opportunities that were given to them, and they felt threatened, basically. Right. And so they lynched them. So she revealed that in her book too. So I don't know if you want to call her a success or a failure, but I think it's pretty cool. I mean, she was an African American and a woman. That's two strikes against her, and she stood up to it. That's pretty amazing. All right. That's it for me. Any questions over progressives? All right. You guys can work on your study guides. You can work on